They did not walk into a dungeon, nor onto a battlefield scarred by centuries of blood. They walked into a room that looked ordinary, too ordinary. White walls stretched from floor to ceiling, each corner sharp and clean, untouched by the grime of the outside world. Fluorescent lights buzzed with a faint mechanical hum, the kind of sterile glow that belongs in offices and hospitals, a glow that makes everything feel slightly unreal. The men who greeted them held clipboards, their expressions practiced, calm and authoritative. The tone in their voices was clinical, almost soothing, as if they were physicians rather than gatekeepers to something darker. To the volunteers it seemed routine, harmless, even exciting. They shook hands, offered nervous smiles, and reassured themselves with the same refrain whispered in their minds: "This is just an experiment." But behind the sterile silence, something was waiting. It was not a sound, nor a figure lurking in shadows. It was a seed, invisible yet alive, lying dormant inside every human being. Every instruction spoken by the men with clipboards, every uniform folded neatly on the table, every locked door that clicked shut behind them was more than a detail. Each was a key, turning quietly inside a lock they did not know existed. With each turn, something inside them shifted. What began as curiosity began to harden into compliance. They could not see it, but the walls themselves seemed to watch them, whispering promises of transformation. They weren't criminals. They weren't soldiers trained for violence or cruelty. They were people like us, students chasing a little extra money, workers intrigued by the promise of being part of a scientific study, neighbors who might water your plants or hold open a door. They came dressed in jeans, t-shirts, and casual shoes, ordinary lives still clinging to them. And yet within hours those ordinary skins began to peel away. Kindness fractured like glass struck with a hidden hammer. Jokes dissolved into silence. Smiles sharpened into shouts. What had once been instructions written on paper soon turned into weapons wielded by human voices. The room had not changed, but they had. Each step, each decision, each nod of obedience carried them further from themselves, until the line between the volunteer and the monster grew impossibly thin. History is filled with tyrants and killers, with men whose names are carved into the collective memory as symbols of cruelty. But this was different. This was not a dictator seizing control, not a general ordering troops into slaughter. This was something quieter, more unsettling. It was proof that you don't need a monster to commit monstrous acts. You only need a system, an order spoken firmly, a role assigned with authority, and a human mind willing to obey. The transformation was not immediate, not sudden. It was a slow drift, like a tide rising in silence, until the water is already at your chest, and you do not remember when it began. That was the power of this room. It revealed not the fragility of the few, but the hidden capacity of us all. Tonight we step into that room, not as participants, but as witnesses. We stand in the doorway and watch as the ordinary becomes extraordinary, as laughter becomes cruelty, as fear becomes power. What makes this story so haunting is not simply the experiment itself, but the realization it leaves behind. For what happened here was not confined to one set of walls in one decade of history. What happened here lingers in the questions we ask about ourselves, our neighbors, our leaders. It lingers in the memory of every order ever given, every time a person has chosen to obey rather than resist. There is something unsettling about the quiet way it all began. Imagine it: the shuffle of shoes against linoleum, the scratching of pens on forms, the low hum of fluorescent bulbs. The room could have been anywhere, belonging to no particular place. There were no skulls on the wall, no bars across the windows. Nothing warned them that their reflections would soon be strangers. The very normality of it all was the trick. Horror did not announce itself with blood, but with simplicity. That is why they laughed nervously. That is why they believed it was safe. And that is why, when the change began, they could not see it until it was already too late. Psychologists often speak of thresholds, the invisible line between thought and action, morality and surrender. This room was built upon thresholds. Every locked door closed behind them did not simply secure a space. It erased an option. Every uniform slipped over the shoulders was not just clothing. It was a costume, a mask that carried with it new expectations. Authority does not always need a whip or a gun. Sometimes it needs only a lab coat, a clipboard, and a voice that says, "This is the procedure." And once that voice is obeyed, once that mask is worn, the person beneath it begins to fade. We like to imagine ourselves immune. We tell ourselves that we, unlike others, would resist, that we would not shout, not obey, not harm. We cling to the idea that morality is a shield strong enough to withstand orders. Yet the truth is more fragile. The men and women in that room told themselves the same thing before it began. They believed they were different, better, unshakable. But when the walls closed in and the system pressed its weight against them, they discovered what most of us are too afraid to admit, that the monster is not an outsider waiting to invade. It is a possibility resting inside, silent, patient, and eager for the right moment. This experiment did not need chains or cages. It needed no battlefield, no smoke of war. It needed only willing participants and the suggestion that their actions were part of something larger than themselves. That suggestion was enough to turn laughter into silence, silence into compliance, and compliance into cruelty. And as we move deeper into their story, the question becomes not why they changed, but how quickly and what that says about us. For if ordinary people can be transformed by nothing more than a uniform, a locked door, and a voice of authority, then the terrifying truth is unavoidable. The line between good and evil is not carved into the world. It runs through every one of us. Tonight, as we walk with them into that room, as we listen to the echo of orders given and the silence of obedience, we uncover a haunting truth that refuses to fade. The monster was never out there. The monster was never waiting in the shadows. The monster was waiting inside. They say the most dangerous stories do not begin in darkness but in light. The hallways were bright, the atmosphere calm, the setting unthreatening. It was not a dungeon carved from stone or a battlefield soaked with blood. It was an academic building, the kind students walked past every morning on their way to class. The air smelled faintly of chalk dust, of coffee drifting from faculty offices, of polished linoleum floors. This was a place of knowledge, a place people trusted. And that trust, silent, unquestioned, was the first seed planted. The world of the time was built on faith in progress. Science was king and authority was its crown. Men in white coats commanded respect without ever raising their voices. Their words carried the weight of truth. Their clipboards were more powerful than weapons, and their instructions felt less like commands and more like inevitabilities. For ordinary people, this was reassuring. Obedience was not only safe, it was celebrated. To follow rules meant belonging. To trust the system meant you were on the right side of history. The Cold War had drawn deep lines across the globe. People saw science as a shield, a tool that would guarantee survival, advancement, victory. Rockets pierced the sky. Nuclear weapons loomed. Computers began whispering their first promises of a new age. If authority claimed progress required sacrifice, most would nod, even smile, because progress meant safety. People believed that by submitting to institutions, they were pushing civilization forward. In classrooms, in laboratories, in government offices, obedience had become a virtue. And so when a new research project was announced, it barely raised an eyebrow. It was framed as academic curiosity, nothing more. The idea that an experiment could hold hidden danger felt absurd. After all, danger lived elsewhere, in war zones, in prisons, in places far from the quiet hum of university walls. Here people saw clipboards and test tubes, not chains and cages. Here people saw knowledge, not cruelty. Yet the irony lingered in the air like static. The most haunting dangers are the ones that wear the mask of safety. Those who volunteered felt no dread. Some were students hoping to earn a little money. Others were townsfolk curious to be part of something intellectual. They arrived with optimism, shaking hands with researchers, filling out forms with casual smiles. They wore the clothes of everyday life, jeans, shirts, worn shoes. Nothing about them screamed villain or victim. They were ordinary people, neighbors, classmates, co-workers. And perhaps that is what makes what followed so terrifying. Monsters do not always march in with fangs bared. Sometimes they walk in laughing, believing they are safe. The room itself was painfully plain. White walls, harsh lights buzzing above, clipboards stacked neatly in the hands of calm professional men. Nothing screamed menace. The very ordinariness of it all disarmed the imagination. If one were to capture a photograph of that moment, the volunteers chatting, the researchers jotting notes, it would look like any other study in any other university. But photographs cannot capture the invisible weight pressing against the walls, the potential for human nature to fracture under pressure. There was something intoxicating about the atmosphere of the era. People craved certainty. They wanted to believe that science could explain everything, that systems could protect them from chaos, that following instructions was the same as being moral. To question authority felt not only rebellious but dangerous. After all, history had shown that disobedience could bring punishment, isolation, or worse. The world had only just emerged from a war where obedience was survival, and yet it was that same obedience that had fueled atrocities. No one wanted to confront that contradiction. It was easier to look away. The newspapers spoke of progress daily, of machines built to think, of medicines created to heal, of governments that promised order in exchange for loyalty. People believed it. Why wouldn't they? Chaos was frightening. Order was comforting. If the men in suits and uniforms said progress required obedience, then obedience was good. And if obedience was good, then surely there was no harm in following instructions in a controlled academic setting. But beneath that faith in progress ran a darker current. Authority is never neutral. It reshapes those who obey it. It doesn't need to shout, it doesn't need to threaten. It only needs to exist, to offer the illusion of safety, and people will surrender far more than they ever imagined. They will tell themselves they are safe, even as the walls close in. The volunteers laughed nervously, filling the silence with casual chatter. They believed they were part of something harmless. They believed they would return home unchanged. Yet the room was already working on them. The uniforms waiting on hangers, the roles being quietly assigned, the locked doors with their subtle finality. Each element was a key, each key unlocking a part of the mind better left untouched. What makes this beginning so chilling is its innocence. There was no obvious villain standing at the door, no gun held to anyone's head, no battlefield forcing decisions of life and death. There was only paperwork, polite voices, and the promise of contributing to knowledge. The trap was not physical, it was psychological. And because it was invisible, no one saw it coming. To understand how easily the stage was set, one must remember, ordinary values prepared the ground. Respect for authority, belief in science, desire for order, trust in progress. Each of these seemed harmless on its own, even admirable. Combined, they became the perfect soil for manipulation. Like bricks in a wall, they built a structure strong enough to hold people captive without ever locking a single chain. Imagine walking into that room. Imagine believing you are helping, contributing, maybe even making history. Imagine hearing the calm voice of a man in a white coat telling you what to do and feeling no reason to question him. Imagine the security of the setting, the way the walls and lights reassure you that this is safe. Then imagine how easily you could follow the first instruction, then the second, then the third. Each one small, each one harmless, or so it seems. Until the line between safety and danger vanishes, and you do not even notice you've crossed it. The experiment had not yet begun, but in truth it had already started the moment those volunteers walked through the door. The very act of stepping into that room was a choice laden with trust, a trust that would soon be tested, twisted, and broken. Every detail of the world outside had prepared them for this moment. Society had taught them obedience was good. Culture had taught them authority was right. Science had taught them progress demanded sacrifice. And so when the time came, they would obey, not because they were evil, not because they wished harm, but because the stage had been set so perfectly they could not imagine doing otherwise. The danger was never in the room itself. The danger was in the minds that walked into it, carrying the weight of history, culture, and trust. That is the silent terror of this beginning, the realization that what looked like safety was, in truth, a carefully constructed illusion. As the lights buzzed above and the clipboards rustled, the audience of history leaned forward. No one could see the abyss waiting beneath the surface, but it was there, silent, patient, inevitable. And in the end, the greatest horror of all was this: nothing about that room looked dangerous. Nothing at all. They came because of an ad. That was all it took. A simple flyer tacked to a university bulletin board, a short notice slipped into the local paper, a rumor passed from one student to another, volunteers needed for a study on memory and learning. Compensation will be provided. It didn't sound sinister. It didn't even sound remarkable. It sounded like the kind of opportunity young people jumped at every day. An easy way to earn money, a chance to participate in something that felt important. They didn't know it yet, but in answering that call they had already stepped into a story far bigger than themselves. What looked like curiosity, what looked like ambition, was in fact the first step into a trap so subtle they could not see the jaws closing. The room they walked into was not a dungeon or a prison. It was clean, sterile, professional. The very ordinariness of it disarmed them. A receptionist greeted them with a polite smile, a clipboard in hand. Papers to sign, procedures to follow. Nothing unusual, nothing frightening. A few even joked as they scribbled down their names. One whispered to another, "Easy cash, man, we just sit and answer questions." Another laughed nervously, tugging on his sleeve as if to shake off a tension he couldn't quite name. They didn't know they were already being observed. Every flicker of their eyes, every nervous laugh, every hand that hesitated over the consent form, all of it noted, recorded, filed away. To the men in white coats, these were not just volunteers. They were raw material. They were clay to be molded. And yet at that moment they were ordinary. That is the chilling truth. They were not villains, not criminals, not hardened soldiers with blood on their hands. They were neighbors, friends, brothers, students. One had plans to meet his girlfriend after the session. Another was saving up for a new car. Their ordinariness was their disguise, and it was the most terrifying disguise of all, because it meant they could be anyone. As they waited, sitting in rows of plastic chairs, their conversations buzzed with excitement. Some speculated about what the study might involve. Memory tests, flashcards, maybe a little problem-solving. Probably like those IQ puzzles, one said, tapping his foot with anticipation. "I'm good at those." Another, quieter, confessed that she just wanted the money. "Rent's due," she shrugged. Laughter rippled, the kind of laughter you hear in a cafeteria, in a classroom, in the easy spaces of ordinary life. No one suspected that within hours, those same voices would harden into commands, that those same faces would contort in anger or avert their eyes from pain. The scientists, or what appeared to be scientists, moved through the room with calm efficiency. Their white lab coats gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Their clipboards clicked with notes. They were polite, reassuring, authoritative. Everything about them whispered safety. This is official. This is professional. This is science. And science in their minds was progress. Science was noble. Science was safe. "Thank you for volunteering," one of them said, his tone warm but firm. "Your participation will help us better understand human behavior." The words hung in the air, powerful and persuasive. To help humanity, I wouldn't want that. No one stopped to wonder what those words really meant. No one asked what kind of behavior would be studied, or how it would be tested. They trusted the man in the coat, the clipboard in his hand, the calm authority in his voice. Trust. That was the invisible currency in the room, and it was given freely. They trusted the institution. They trusted the system. They trusted the idea that harm could not come from something labeled as science. Even when they were asked to surrender their personal belongings, phones, wallets, watches, they complied without protest. It was framed as routine procedure, and so they obeyed. Step by step, the walls of their world shifted. The simple act of handing over a phone was, in truth, an act of surrender, a tiny test of obedience, a signal to the experimenters that the process was working. The volunteers didn't see it that way. To them it was nothing, but in hindsight, that nothing was the first crack in the armor of their autonomy. The air in the waiting room began to thicken. Time stretched. Minutes turned to hours. Restless chatter gave way to silence. Some tapped their fingers against their knees. Others stared at the floor. Still others glanced at the closed doors at the end of the hall, wondering what lay behind them. The anticipation was no longer playful. It had grown heavy, tinged with unease. And then came the call. "Next group, please." The chosen ones stood, trying to shake off the weight in their stomachs. They walked down a narrow corridor, the sound of their footsteps echoing against sterile walls. Their laughter was gone now, replaced by tight smiles and darting glances. The door ahead swung open, revealing a room that looked as ordinary as the rest. Desks, machines, wires, a thick instruction manual stacked neatly on the table. Nothing that screamed danger. Nothing that screamed cruelty. But that was the genius of it. The danger was hidden in plain sight. The cruelty was disguised as procedure. Every piece of paper, every switch, every instruction was carefully designed to blur the line between choice and command. The volunteers didn't know this. To them, it was still just an experiment. A harmless role to play, a task to complete. One was told he would act as a teacher, another a learner. Simple roles, framed as part of a memory test. The teacher would ask questions. If the learner gave a wrong answer, the teacher would administer a shock. Harmless, they were told. Uncomfortable, perhaps, but not dangerous. The scientists said so, and so it must be true. The teachers laughed awkwardly, glancing at one another. Shocks, you're kidding, right? The man in the lab coat shook his head, expression neutral. All perfectly safe. The word safe echoed louder than it should have. It quieted doubt. It silenced questions. And so they agreed. None of them thought to refuse. None of them thought to walk out. Because walking out would mean distrust. Walking out would mean admitting that science could be dangerous, that authority could be wrong, that something labeled progress could in fact be horror, and that thought was too heavy to bear. It was easier to stay, easier to trust, easier to obey. The first switches were flipped with nervous hands. The first commands were spoken with hesitant voices. The learner winced, cried out in discomfort, and the teacher flinched. But then came the reassuring nod from the man in the coat, the calm voice instructing, "Please continue." And so they did. Each time it grew easier. Each time the hesitation faded. What had once seemed cruel began to feel like routine. What had once drawn gasps of sympathy now drew only blank stares, clipped commands, tightened jaws. The volunteers who had entered laughing, joking, ordinary were changing. They did not see it. But the experimenters did. The monster was stirring, stretching, learning to walk. And the most horrifying part, these volunteers still thought they were safe. Still thought they were doing something noble. Still thought they were in control. They were wrong. They were not volunteers anymore. They were not helpers, not students, not curious minds seeking knowledge. They were becoming something else. Slowly, imperceptibly, they were becoming instruments, tools, victims of their own trust, their own obedience, victims of a system designed to strip away their humanity. One instruction, one nod, one order at a time. Volunteers or victims? The answer was already written in their trembling hands, in the sweat on their brows, in the way their voices echoed when they repeated orders they no longer believed in. They had walked in willingly, with smiles and laughter, but now, without even realizing it, they belonged to the experiment, and the experiment belonged to them. The room was quiet, almost too quiet. White walls stretched across the space, smooth and unmarked, as if no human presence had ever left a trace there. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed with a sterile hum, casting a cold glow that stripped warmth from every face. To an outsider, the room would look unremarkable. Just another space within a university, just another place where research was conducted. But to those who stepped inside, the room held a strange weight. It was not the furniture, not the papers, not even the people that gave it gravity. It was the atmosphere of control, subtle yet undeniable, the kind that begins not with shouts or demands, but with a quiet, unspoken promise. Here you will follow. The experiment had barely begun, yet already authority was present. Not in the form of violence, not in the form of visible coercion, but in symbols. White lab coats, for instance, carried a power far beyond their fabric. When the men conducting the study appeared in them, their voices no longer sounded like mere suggestions. They carried the weight of command. The clipboards in their hands, the lanyards around their necks, the tone of efficiency in their speech all became signals to the volunteers that these were figures to be obeyed. No one questioned why. They simply did. It began with simple instructions. Sit here, sign this, wait quietly. Each command was small, harmless, wrapped in the politeness of procedure. Yet hidden within those small acts was the seed of submission. Authority does not need to roar in its first moments. It needs only to be accepted. Once obedience is given, even for something trivial, the mind adjusts. It begins to normalize compliance, to bend without realizing it is bending. This is how chains are forged, not by iron but by repetition. The volunteers complied willingly, almost eagerly. After all, they had come here expecting structure. They were told this was a study, and studies had rules. To follow those rules was not only expected, but respectable. Some even felt pride in doing so, as if their cooperation made them part of something larger, something noble. They did not yet realize that this very pride was the first layer of their captivity. To obey authority was not only easy, it felt right. But authority does not only live in uniforms and instructions, it also thrives in roles. From the very beginning, participants were divided, some into the position of authority, others into the position of submission. On paper it was simple, almost playful, a role-playing exercise, a simulation. Yet the moment those labels were attached, behavior began to shift. The so-called guards straightened their backs, lifted their chins, and spoke with new confidence. The prisoners lowered their eyes, laughed nervously, and shuffled their feet. No real power had yet been exercised, and still the roles worked like invisible scripts guiding every action. Human beings, it seemed, did not just play roles, they became them. This was the birth of authority, not as a command forced upon unwilling people, but as a subtle transformation that participants themselves embraced. Authority gave structure. Authority gave clarity, and within that clarity, individuals surrendered pieces of themselves. A uniform was not just clothing, it was a mask. A title was not just a word, it was an identity. By accepting these roles, the volunteers unknowingly surrendered their individuality to the system. They were no longer John or Sarah or Ahmed. They were guard or prisoner, scientist or subject. Their humanity blurred beneath the weight of designation. What made this transformation chilling was its ordinariness. No one protested. No one resisted. In fact, many welcomed it. Structure was comforting. Rules removed uncertainty. In the outside world, ambiguity reigned, but within these walls, every step was dictated. There was safety in obedience. And yet safety is often the most dangerous illusion, for when obedience feels safe, the door to cruelty opens silently without resistance. The men in lab coats, the ones holding clipboards and speaking with calm authority, did not need to shout. They did not need to threaten. Their quiet words carried more weight than any scream. Why? Because the room itself had been constructed to support their authority. Locked doors, controlled schedules, surveillance, all whispered the same message: you are not in control here. And when people believe they are not in control, they hand over power willingly, grateful for someone else to decide for them. The volunteers told themselves they were still free. After all, they had chosen to be here. They had signed the papers willingly. They could leave if they wanted, couldn't they? But with every passing instruction followed, with every form signed and every role accepted, the possibility of leaving grew smaller in their minds, not because the doors were locked, but because the invisible chains of authority wrapped tighter around them. Freedom was still technically theirs, but psychologically it was slipping away. Authority thrives not only on commands but on compliance. Every time a participant obeyed, it reinforced the authority of those giving orders. It was a cycle, a loop, endlessly feeding itself. The more the guards obeyed the scientists, the more they felt entitled to command the prisoners. The more the prisoners obeyed the guards, the more they confirmed their own subjugation. What began as a simple structure became a hierarchy. And what began as a hierarchy became something far darker, a system where authority existed for its own sake, needing no justification beyond the fact that it was there. One of the most chilling truths of the human mind is that authority does not always feel external. Over time it begins to seep inward, becoming internalized. The guards no longer acted because the scientists told them to. They acted because the role demanded it, because authority had become part of their identity. To disobey would not only challenge the system, but betray the mask they now wore. Authority was no longer a uniform on their body. It was a voice inside their head. And what of the prisoners? Their submission deepened too. At first their obedience was cautious, even playful, as though they were simply going along with the game. But as rules grew stricter and orders became heavier, submission turned to habit. They did not just obey, they expected to obey. Resistance became unthinkable, even absurd. After all, who were they to question authority? Who were they to break the rules? They were prisoners now, and prisoners do not resist. Their chains were not metal. They were mental. The birth of authority in that sterile room revealed a terrifying truth. Human beings do not need to be forced into obedience. They step into it willingly, often gratefully when structure is offered to them. They mistake control for safety, order for morality. And once the mask of authority is accepted, once the role becomes identity, cruelty becomes possible. Not because people are evil, but because they no longer see themselves as people at all. They are guards, prisoners, scientists. They are roles. They are functions, and roles do not question. They act. It is easy to imagine that authority is loud, oppressive, and obvious. But in that room it was quiet, calm, almost invisible. It was a whisper that said, "Follow the rules." It was a clipboard that said, "Trust the process." It was a locked door that said, "You cannot leave." And the most haunting part was that Noon needed to fight it. The participants surrendered themselves piece by piece until their own identities dissolved into the system. This was not the authority of kings or dictators. This was the authority of structure itself, the kind that hides in plain sight, shaping lives without a single scream. Authority was born not in violence but in silence. And in that silence, ordinary people began their descent, not realizing that the roles they embraced would soon demand far more than obedience. They would demand their humanity. They entered the room as ordinary people, holding on to the quiet certainty that they would not be changed. The air smelled of disinfectant, and fluorescent lights hummed softly above, casting their pale glow on the white walls. Everything felt safe, clinical, and professional, as though nothing harmful could possibly happen in a place designed for research. The participants still exchanged smiles, even small jokes, as if this was no more than a routine test of memory or learning. Yet beneath that surface, tiny tremors were already at work. The cracks in certainty are never loud at first. They are whispers, subtle movements, shifts too small to notice, until they become impossible to ignore. The first instruction seemed harmless. Sit here, wait there, sign this form. Each action was ordinary, yet each step pulled them deeper into a framework designed not for their comfort, but for control. The volunteers obeyed because the requests were reasonable. What could be the danger in following such simple directions? A clipboard was handed over, and the authority of paper and pen created an illusion of necessity. They signed without hesitation, binding themselves to rules they had not yet read fully, promising obedience to instructions whose nature they could not imagine. Already the first seed was planted, the willingness to comply without knowing the cost. Obedience did not arrive with a sudden order shouted in their faces. It slipped in quietly through routine. Stand here. Answer this. Put on this uniform. The uniform in particular seemed harmless, a simple garment, nothing more than fabric. But when cloth is placed in the right setting, it ceases to be fabric. It becomes a symbol. The participants laughed as they adjusted the stiff material, but beneath the laughter was something new, the faint pressure of identity being reshaped. No one told them explicitly, "You are different now." Yet as the clothes hung heavy on their shoulders, they began to feel a difference they could not quite name. The uniform blurred individuality, marking them as part of something larger, something controlled. The first true crack appeared not in the form of cruelty, but in hesitation. One volunteer, tasked with reading out a list of instructions, paused. The rules seemed strange, maybe unnecessary. He frowned, almost questioned, but the silence of others pressed on him. Around him, participants nodded, obeyed, or simply avoided eye contact. The pressure was invisible but undeniable. To resist meant to stand alone to disrupt the flow, and so the hesitation dissolved, replaced by a nervous chuckle and eventual compliance. The group moved on, as though nothing had happened. Yet in that small moment, something fundamental had shifted. Doubt had been silenced not by force, but by the quiet weight of conformity. Laughter became a shield. When an instruction felt awkward, participants laughed to hide discomfort. Jokes spilled into the sterile room, small bursts of human warmth in a place that was beginning to feel colder. But the laughter was hollow, a cover for unease. Each laugh allowed obedience to slip by unnoticed. With every joke, they assured themselves that nothing was truly wrong, that following orders was part of the fun. Beneath the noise, however, conscience was being numbed. What felt uncomfortable no longer needed to be resisted if it could be disguised as humor. The experimenters never shouted. They did not threaten. They simply asked. Yet their calm, steady voices carried weight heavier than any scream. Each instruction was framed as procedure, necessary for science, part of the system they had all agreed to join. It became harder to say no. The room itself seemed to conspire with authority. The walls were too white, too sterile, the locked doors too absolute. Every physical detail whispered, "You are not here to decide, you are here to follow." And so when the next request came, one slightly more uncomfortable than the last, the volunteers obeyed again. Not joyfully, not eagerly, but without real resistance. One participant, asked to record data, noticed that the numbers felt manipulated. They hesitated, pen hovering above paper. The silence grew heavy, all eyes waiting. An experimenter's gaze, calm but unyielding, rested on them. The participant's chest tightened, their throat dry. To speak out felt impossible. And so the pen scratched across paper, writing what was asked. It was such a small act, just numbers, just ink. Yet it was the kind of act that begins the erosion of conscience. Integrity bent slightly, and the bend went unnoticed. The cracks widened slowly. Instructions that would once have been questioned now passed without challenge. One participant, asked to give a small reprimand to another, laughed nervously but did it anyway. The reprimand was mild, even playful, but the act carried weight. To correct another person at the command of authority was not natural, not ordinary. Yet they obeyed, and the moment passed without comment. What none of them realized was that each of these moments was a rehearsal, a quiet training for greater obedience still to come. The room itself became part of the pressure. Time lost meaning inside its walls. Without windows, without clocks, participants drifted in a world where the only rhythm was the voice of authority. Instructions came like waves, steady, unstoppable. The participants adapted not because they agreed, but because adaptation was easier than resistance. The sterile environment eroded individuality, transforming the room into a stage where people acted out roles that were slowly being written for them. By now, discomfort had become routine. When someone hesitated, the group's silence suffocated them. When someone laughed, the group laughed too, turning fear into shared performance. Each small obedience laid the foundation for larger ones. What no one noticed was how far they had already drifted. They still believed themselves free, still told themselves that they were making choices. Yet the cracks in conscience were deepening, spreading silently like fractures beneath glass. One participant tried to object briefly, when asked to complete an action that felt unnecessary. Their voice trembled as they said, "Do we really have to?" The question hung in the air, fragile, but the response was swift. A calm explanation followed. This was procedure, this was science, this was necessary. The authority figure smiled, spoke softly, reassured. And the participant nodded, even smiled back, ashamed of their own doubt. The objection collapsed, swallowed by the smooth machinery of authority. The crack widened again. The tragedy of this stage was not dramatic. There were no screams, no overt cruelty. The tragedy was quiet, almost invisible. It was in the way hesitation became compliance, the way laughter became surrender, the way silence crushed questions. Each small act seemed insignificant, yet together they built a foundation strong enough to hold far greater horrors. What began as harmless instructions was slowly transforming into something else. Though the participants could not yet see it, the cracks were spreading across their moral ground, and soon the weight pressing upon them would shatter it completely. The most frightening truth was not what they had done, but what they had not done. They had not resisted. They had not spoken out. They had not said no, and in their silence obedience became easier, natural, expected. The experimenters had not forced them. They had only guided, suggested, framed. The participants had walked willingly, one small step at a time, toward a place they did not yet recognize. The cracks had opened, and through them seeped the shadow of what was to come. The first crack is never loud. It is the silence after hesitation, the laughter masking fear, the quiet nod that replaces a question. It is the ordinary moment when conscience bends unnoticed under the weight of authority, and once the first crack appears, the rest is only amateur of time. They did not recognize the moment it began. That was the unsettling part. There was no dramatic signal, not thunderclap announcing the crossing of a moral line. Instead, the transformation slipped into the room like a draught of cold air, unnoticed until it was already chilling their bones. A command was given, soft and clinical. Hesitation followed, then a nervous laugh, then compliance. It seemed harmless. It always seemed harmless at first. Yet in that single act, so small, so dismissible, something irreversible had shifted. The human conscience, once a barrier of resistance, had taken its first step towards silence. The volunteers no longer resembled the curious, eager individuals who had signed their names on the consent forms. Their posture had changed. Their tone had sharpened. The way they looked at one another was different, less as peers, more as roles. The division between guard and prisoner had hardened. though both sides were still ordinary people. At first the differences were theatrical, part of the game, a uniform here, a key there, but the longer the experiment unfolded, the more those props became identities. The guards began to embody authority. The prisoners began to embody submission. And within that dynamic, humanity started to blur. It began with language. Words are powerful weapons, often sharper than steel. Guards stopped calling prisoners by their names. Instead, numbers replaced identities. One became prisoner 1034, another prisoner 819. The shift was subtle yet devastating. A number is easier to control than a person. A number does not carry memories, families, dreams, or dignity. A number is faceless, replaceable, and so when a guard ordered 1034, stand up, it carried none of the human weight of telling John, the student, or Ahmed, the worker, to stand. With a number, empathy is cut away. With a number, cruelty becomes efficient. Soon after, tone followed words. Guards no longer asked politely. They commanded. The sharpness in their voices surprised even them, but they quickly normalized it. What felt uncomfortable at first soon felt natural, even justified. After all, they were simply fulfilling the role assigned to them. They were told to maintain order. They were told to ensure discipline. And discipline required firmness. Firmness required force. And force once tasted was intoxicating. Prisoners, too, began to transform. At first they resisted, laughing, shrugging, refusing to take the game seriously. But resistance brought consequences. Orders grew louder, punishments sharper, privileges stripped away. One prisoner who laughed at a command found himself deprived of food. Another, who rolled his eyes, was forced to perform endless repetitions of meaningless tasks. The laughter faded quickly. Defiance turned into silence. Silence turned into obedience. The prisoners no longer joked about the absurdity of it all. They lowered their heads, avoided eye contact, and responded to orders without hesitation. In this new world, kindness became weakness. Guards who hesitated in enforcing rules were mocked by their peers. A guard who once said please when giving instructions was ridiculed for being too soft. To prove themselves, they overcompensated, raising their voices, issuing harsher punishments, demonstrating that they too could wield power without remorse. One could see the subtle competition emerge, a contest of cruelty, where dominance became the measure of authority. And then the punishments escalated. At first they were minor, making prisoners stand for extended periods, depriving them of breaks, enforcing silence. But soon they grew harsher. Prisoners were forced into humiliating tasks, cleaning toilets with their bare hands, crawling across the floor, singing songs at the command of the guards. The humiliation was deliberate. It stripped away dignity, reducing individuals into caricatures of obedience. For the guards it was framed as discipline. For the prisoners it was degradation. The terrifying part was not that guards obeyed orders. It was how quickly they adapted, how effortlessly they embraced the cruelty. What had begun as reluctant compliance became enthusiasm. Some guards smiled as they shouted. Others laughed at the prisoners' suffering. One guard discovered a dark sense of creativity in inventing punishments, proudly boasting of new ways to enforce control. They were not coerced into cruelty. They leaned into it. The experiment had not forced transformation, it had revealed it. Meanwhile, the prisoners' transformation was just as chilling. They internalized the role of submission so deeply that some began to police each other. If one prisoner disobeyed, others scolded him, fearing collective punishment. If one expressed anger, others silenced him, desperate to avoid drawing attention. They began to believe they were powerless, that resistance was futile. Their world had shrunk to the size of the experiment's walls, and within those walls, survival meant obedience. The psychological trap was complete. Guards had shed their humanity in favor of authority. Prisoners had shed their dignity in favor of survival. Thaline between who they had been and who they had become was nearly unrecognizable. The same students, workers, neighbors who had once chatted casually outside the lab were now locked in a ritual of dominance and submission, each playing a role so convincingly that the role consumed their identity. But the most disturbing revelation was not the acts of cruelty themselves. It was how ordinary they appeared. Her guard shouting at a prisoner to stand in the corner no longer seemed monstrous. It seemed routine. A prisoner trembling under pressure no longer seemed shocking, it seemed expected. The extraordinary had become ordinary, the horrific had become mundane. This normalization of cruelty was the true transformation. It was not the loud, dramatic collapse of morality, but the quiet erosion of conscience, until nothing was left. One day a prisoner broke down. He cried, sobbed uncontrollably, insisting he could not endure another moment. The guards watched, uncertain at first, then quickly composed themselves. They responded not with compassion, but with annoyance. They mocked his tears, ordered him to continue his tasks, and reminded him of the rules. The prisoner begged for release, his voice shaking with desperation. But the rules, the system, the experiment itself, these were stronger than his pleas. The guards enforced the structure without hesitation, and the others, both prisoners and guards, accepted it as normal. The transformation was now complete. The guards had become enforcers. The prisoners had become subjects, and the experiment, though still wrapped in the sterile language of science, had birthed a world indistinguishable from tyranny. What made it terrifying was not that monsters had entered the room, but that ordinary people had walked in, and the experiment had shown how quickly they could become something else entirely. These were not sadists, not criminals, not soldiers hardened by war. They were students seeking extra money, young people curious about psychology, individuals who had laughed and joked only days before. And yet, under the weight of authority, roles, and rules, they transformed into beings capable of cruelty, submission, and indifference. This is the haunting truth. Transformation does not require evil intentions. It does not require hatred or malice. It only requires a structure, an order, and a willingness to obey. The guards obeyed, the prisoners obeyed, and in their obedience humanity fractured. When the experiment finally ended, when the uniforms were removed, when the numbers were discarded, the participants were forced to confront themselves. Some could not recognize the people they had become. Guards were horrified by the commands they had given, the punishments they had delivered, the enjoyment they had felt in wielding power. Prisoners were haunted by the obedience they had shown, the silence they had chosen, the dignity they had surrendered without a fight. The transformation could not be undone. The memories lingered, a permanent scar etched into their minds. The experiment was over, but the revelation remained. Ordinary people, placed in extraordinary conditions, had crossed boundaries they never thought possible. They had proven that the line between good and evil is not a wall. It is a thread, fragile and easily broken. And once broken, the descent is swift, irreversible, and terrifying. This is the true horror of the transformation. It was not that monsters were created, but that monsters were revealed. And if it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. The room had not changed in appearance. Its walls remained the same pale white, its light still buzzing faintly overhead, its corners still barren of decoration or comfort. Yet something intangible had shifted, something that could not be measured by clipboards or noted on forms. The atmosphere itself had grown heavier, as if invisible shadows now pressed down upon the air. The sterile chamber, once described as neutral, now carried the weight of betrayal, cruelty, and fear. It was no longer merely a room. It had become a stage where trust was dismantled, and where human nature, stripped of its disguises, revealed its darker truths. At the beginning, laughter had filled these walls, nervous chuckles when forms were signed, small jokes exchanged between strangers who might soon become friends. But those laughs were fading memories now, like echoes swallowed by time. In their place came silence, an oppressive silence broken only by the clipped tone of authority figures giving orders and the hesitant responses of those told to obey. Yet even silence did not last long. Soon hesitation gave way to shouts, shouts to cries, and cries to something more terrifying: indifference. The experiment was unfolding into a nightmare where cruelty became routine, and trust was not merely broken but weaponized. Betrayal did not arrive with thunder. It crept in slowly, like a shadow stretching across the floor. The first signs were subtle, participants hesitating before helping one another, avoiding eye contact or shifting uncomfortably when asked to act against a fellow volunteer. At first, these seemed like small cracks, like the kind of awkwardness that could be forgiven with a shrug. But each compromise widened the fracture. Each reluctant step away from compassion created a void where suspicion could take root. And once suspicion was planted, it grew quickly. fed by the authority that loomed over them like an unblinking eye. The experimenters did not need to scream threats. They only had to structure the environment in such a way that mistrust became the path of least resistance. Instructions were given, roles clarified, rules enforced, and suddenly the bonds that had existed between volunteers dissolved. A man who once whispered reassurances to his partner now barked orders at him. A woman who once shared a smile of camaraderie now looked with cold detachment as her peer was reprimanded. Each action might have been explained away as following directions, but beneath the surface, a deeper transformation was at play. The participants were not merely following rules, they were beginning to embody them. Authority did not simply demand obedience, it rewarded division. Those who aligned themselves with the structure, those who played their roles with enthusiasm, found approval. They were acknowledged, affirmed, made to feel that their participation was not only necessary but commendable. And with each nod of approval, a subtle betrayal took place. It was not the betrayal of one person against another alone. It was the betrayal of one's own conscience. To earn approval, kindness was sacrificed. To belong, compassion was silenced. And so the room filled with shadows, not literal darkness, but the suffocating presence of corrupted loyalty. The cruelty that emerged did not look monstrous at first. It was not the image of blood-stained tyrants or wild-eyed villains. It was quieter, more chilling. It was in the shrug of a participant who allowed another to suffer because that's the rule. It was in the laughter of someone mocking a peer, disguising cruelty as humor. It was in the deliberate turning away when someone begged for help. This was betrayal in its most insidious form, not dramatic acts of treachery, but the ordinary refusal to care. The sterile room, with its white walls and fluorescent lights, bore witness to a theater of shadows where the line between victim and perpetrator blurred until it was almost invisible. As roles hardened, trust decayed entirely. Friends who had entered the room together began to see each other not as companions but as obstacles, rivals, or targets. The system had redefined them, reshaping their identities around the roles imposed upon them. And in this new order, betrayal became survival. To resist was to invite punishment. To question was to risk exclusion. To obey was to be safe, or at least safer than the one being punished. The sterile environment became a psychological jungle where self-preservation eclipsed solidarity, and every act of compliance pushed them further from who they once were. The transformation of the room itself was haunting. Once bright with light and possibility, it now felt claustrophobic, as though the walls were inching closer. The fluorescent lights, once merely irritating, now seemed harsh, exposing every flinch, every hesitation, every crack in the human facade. Shadows pooled not in corners but in expressions, in the hardening of eyes, the tightening of jaws, the stiffening of postures as compassion was suppressed. The participants themselves had become the shadows, embodying cruelty while still wearing the faces of ordinary people. That was the most terrifying realization. Nothing about their outward appearance had changed, yet everything inside them was shifting. Betrayal deepened when mocking replaced silence. What began as reluctance to follow orders morphed into active participation. The authority figures no longer had to demand compliance. The participants themselves enforced it, sometimes with an enthusiasm that shocked even them. Shouts were delivered with force, punishments carried out with an air of necessity, and soon the room echoed with sounds of fear. The once neutral space became a chamber of screams and commands, of victims and enforcers, of shadows feeding upon shadows. Each betrayal was a reminder of how fragile trust truly is, and how quickly it can be shattered when authority bends morality out of shape. Perhaps the cruelest betrayal was not between individuals, but within individuals. Each participant had entered the room believing in their own goodness, their own capacity for fairness. They were not villains. They were ordinary people with ordinary lives. Yet now they found themselves committing or permitting acts they would have condemned outside these walls. Their own reflection, if shown to them, might have been unrecognizable. This was the shadow that haunted them most deeply. The realization that the enemy was not only the authority figures orchestrating events, nor the peers who turned against them, but themselves. The betrayal of one's own values is the heaviest shadow of all. The room's transformation was complete when solidarity no longer existed. Laughter had been silenced, compassion erased, and even whispered reassurances replaced by sharp commands. What remained was isolation. Each participant stood alone, even when surrounded by others, because no one could be trusted. The sterile room had become a place of fear, not because of its walls or its lights, but because it revealed how easily human bonds could be broken. Shadows stretched across every mind, and cruelty had become the language through which survival was negotiated. And yet, even in the darkest corners of the experiment, flickers of resistance sometimes emerged. A hesitant glance, a quiet moment of doubt, a participant who faltered before delivering cruelty. These moments did not undo the shadows, but they illuminated them briefly, reminding us that betrayal is not inevitable. Still, the overwhelming weight of authority crushed most resistance, pressing participants back into the roles expected of them. The few flickers of humanity only made the prevailing darkness feel more suffocating, more complete. By the time the experiment reached its crescendo, the room was unrecognizable, not in its physical structure, but in its moral landscape. What had once been ordinary was now contaminated. What had once been harmless was now haunted. The participants themselves had become both victims and perpetrators, their identities fractured by betrayal, their humanity obscured by shadows. And the most haunting truth was not that monsters had been created, but that monsters had been revealed. The shadows had always been there, waiting beneath the surface, needing only the right conditions to step into the light. The sterile room, with its buzzing lights and locked doors, was no longer a laboratory. It was a mirror that reflected not the faces of strangers, but of us all. It showed how easily trust can collapse, how quickly compassion can be traded for survival, how betrayal can become routine. The shadows in the room were not confined to its walls. They followed the participants long after the experiment ended, lingering in their memories, haunting their sense of self. And they follow us too, as we confront the uncomfortable realization. The same shadows live within us, waiting for their turn to awaken. Triggers of darkness, 2,000 words. The descent into cruelty rarely begins with malice. It begins with triggers, subtle, invisible forces that guide human behavior like strings on a puppet. Inside the sterile room of the experiment, participants did not wake up one morning deciding to shout, punish, or betray. They simply followed small cues, nudged step by step into choices that felt less like choices and more like inevitabilities. The world outside may think monsters are born, but here in the flickering hum of fluorescent lights it became clear, monsters are made. And they are made through mechanisms so universal, so deeply human, that none of us can ever truly claim to be immune. The first of these triggers was obedience to authority. It was not shouted orders that broke participants down, but calm instructions delivered with the weight of legitimacy. A man in a lab coat did not need to raise his voice. His presence alone carried the power of centuries of cultural conditioning. Teachers, doctors, police officers, parents, all authority figures woven into memory since childhood. Authority was not just a man giving commands. It was an entire social framework, condensed into a white coat and a clipboard. The participants obeyed not because they were coerced, but because disobedience felt unnatural, even dangerous. To resist authority was to resist the very structure of the world they had always lived in. And so compliance seemed safer, easier, more rational, even when it led them to places they could never have imagined. Yet authority alone was not enough. Fear was the silent companion in the room, hovering in every corner. It was not the kind of fear that comes from immediate danger. No one pointed a weapon at the participants. Instead, it was the fear of standing out, of being judged, of becoming the target. The experiment's design made this fear grow quietly. If one participant hesitated, others noticed. If one questioned an instruction, silence would follow. That silence was heavier than any reprimand, carrying with it the unspoken warning, step out of line and you will be marked. Humans are social creatures, built to avoid shame and rejection, and so fear became a leash keeping them tethered to obedience. Better to comply than to risk isolation. Better to follow than to risk being the one who resisted. But perhaps the most insidious trigger was herd mentality. Inside the room, participants constantly scanned one another for cues. If one obeyed, others followed. If one laughed during cruelty, others joined. The collective shifted the individual, bending private hesitation into public compliance. In groups, people lose their edges. They dissolve into something larger, something less accountable. The diffusion of responsibility meant that no single person felt entirely guilty. The blame was shared, spread so thin that no one carried the full weight of it. And when no one feels responsible, cruelty multiplies unchecked. The herd moved as one, not because each person wanted it, but because each person believed everyone else did. The irony was devastating. Each individual feared isolation, yet it was their desperate clinging to the group that created the very climate of cruelty they privately despised. Dehumanization sealed the transformation. Language shifted subtly at first. Names disappeared, replaced by labels: guard, prisoner, subject. With those labels came distance. Once someone is no longer seen as fully human, their suffering becomes easier to justify. Participants began to talk about others not as friends, not even as people, but as roles in the experiment. When empathy was stripped away, cruelty became easier, almost logical. The sterile environment of the laboratory amplified this effect. Bright lights, locked doors, white walls devoid of personality. It was not a place for individuals. It was a machine, and the people inside it were reduced to moving parts. In such a setting, kindness felt out of place, while cruelty felt like following the rules of the system. What makes these triggers so terrifying is not their presence in the laboratory, but their universality outside it. Obedience to authority fuels not only experiments, but entire regimes. History is stained with moments where men and women followed orders that led to atrocities. Soldiers marching into battlefields of genocide. Citizens denouncing neighbors under totalitarian governments. Workers signing papers that condemned others to suffering. Each believed they were simply doing their duty, obeying authority that seemed legitimate. Few woke up thinking they were committing evil. They thought they were maintaining order, following rules, protecting themselves. The white coat of the laboratory is no different from the uniforms of history. It is a symbol that turns morality into something negotiable. Fear, too, has always been a weapon. Fear silences protest, paralyzes resistance, and isolates individuals until they surrender. It does not need chains or weapons. It only needs the threat of being outcast, punished, or left vulnerable. From witch hunts to political purges, fear has been the engine of compliance, pushing ordinary people to act against conscience for the sake of survival. The participants in the experiment may have feared embarrassment or failure, but their behavior mirrors the same human instinct that on a larger scale enables mass violence. The fear of standing alone can be as powerful as the fear of death. Herd mentality spreads beyond the laboratory as well. Mobs do not form because every individual hungers for violence. They form because individuals swept into a collective surrender their individual judgment. The cheering crowd, the chanting group, the shared identity. These forces blur morality. What feels unthinkable alone feels normal when done together. In the experiment, the herd reinforced cruelty. In society, the herd can justify oppression, exclusion, even killing. Each person tells themselves, "I did not decide this. We decided this." But the "we" is nothing more than a shield, hiding the fact that everyone contributed to the outcome. Dehumanization is perhaps the most chilling trigger, because it transforms compassion into indifference. Wars, slavery, genocide, exploitation, none could exist without first stripping people of their humanity. Labels like enemy, criminal, alien, or other reduce complex human beings into symbols that can be dismissed, punished, or destroyed without guilt. The experiment mirrored this process on a small scale, but the principle is identical. Once someone is no longer seen as one ophis, any action against them becomes easier to justify. It is not cruelty. The participants might tell themselves it is just fulfilling a role. And that justification, repeated over and over, has been the root of humanity's darkest chapters. The room in the experiment may have been small, but its shadows stretched far beyond its walls. Every trigger of darkness revealed inside it exists in the outside world, waiting in workplaces, classrooms, governments, and homes. The story becomes terrifying not because it happened once, but because it continues to happen every day, in countless ways. The psychology of cruelty is not locked in history. It is embedded in humanity. Anyone can be caught in it. Anyone can be reshaped by it. Anyone can surrender to it. The question that lingers is the one most fear to ask. Would we resist or would we obey? It is easy to imagine ourselves as the exception, the one who would stand firm, speak out, and walk away. Yet the experiment suggests otherwise. The participants were not villains. They were students, workers, everyday people, people like us. They laughed, joked, hesitated, doubted. And still the triggers guided them down a path where cruelty felt acceptable. If they could fall, why not us? If they could bend, what makes us believe we would remain unbroken? The haunting truth is that resistance requires more than good intentions. It requires awareness of the triggers and the strength to recognize them when they arise. Authority must be questioned, fear confronted, the herd resisted, and humanity preserved even when the system demands otherwise. Without that vigilance, any ordinary person can become an instrument of darkness. That is what the experiment teaches, not just about them, but about us all. The sterile laboratory may have been dismantled long ago, the lights switched off, the clipboard set aside. But the triggers remain. They lurk in every society, every group, every moment where obedience, fear, conformity, and dehumanization whisper their commands. They do not announce themselves with sirens. They slip quietly into decisions, nudging one step at a time until cruelty no longer feels like cruelty. And once those steps begin, the descent is swift, relentless, and terrifyingly ordinary. The true terror is not what happened in that room. The true terror is knowing it can happen anywhere. The room had changed. Not in its physical design. The sterile walls, the bright fluorescent bulbs, the locked doors were the same, but in the atmosphere, which now pressed down with a suffocating heaviness. The experiment that began with light laughter, with hesitant smiles and polite exchanges, had reached a place where silence had become dangerous and words had grown sharp like blades. The participants no longer looked at each other as equals. Some stood straighter, voices hardened with the tone of authority, while others shrank into obedience, carrying out commands with mechanical precision. It was here, at this juncture, that the breaking point emerged, not as a single moment, but as a series of irreversible steps that dismantled what was left of their shared humanity. At first the cruelty seemed practical, even justifiable. When one participant hesitated to follow an order, a guard stepped in, voice stern, body rigid, to enforce discipline. That enforcement had started with raised eyebrows and sharp words. Then came the barked orders, the threats of punishment, and eventually the application of consequences. Each escalation was justified as necessary to maintain order. The frightening part was not that the participants argued or resisted, it was that they complied. They complied in silence, and that silence became the most deafening sound in the room. One man, who had once joked nervously during the recruitment stage, now barked orders at strangers with a tone of absolute control. His voice no longer trembled. He no longer questioned why. Instead, he relished the power, as though the authority granted to him was a hidden truth he had always known was inside him. Another, who had sworn to herself that she would never cross certain lines, found her resolve collapsing. Each time she obeyed a command that went against her conscience, the next became easier. She told herself it was temporary, an act performed under pressure, but her voice shookless with every command carried out. The breaking point was not just about obedience, it was about transformation. The guards, once tentative, now found themselves giving orders with confidence, almost pride. They punished hesitation as weakness. They mocked vulnerability as though it were a defect to be eliminated. Laughter, once light and harmless, had become a weapon. When a prisoner flinched, someone laughed. When one cried out, someone else smirked. The room's energy shifted from camaraderie to domination, from uncertainty to cruelty. And within that transformation, the boundaries between experiment and reality blurred. What made this stage most horrifying was the ordinariness of it. No one screamed defiantly. No one made dramatic declarations of evil. Instead, cruelty arrived with calm efficiency, with people doing what they were told, believing they were simply fulfilling their role. It was not the monstrous faces of villains that filled the room, but ordinary expressions, blank stares, tight lips, nervous smiles, all masking the truth that the unthinkable was already happening. The breaking point was not a collapse into chaos. It was the rise of order so strict, so unquestioned, that morality had no room left to breathe. As the hours dragged on, the cracks became irreversible. A prisoner who once stood tall, joking with his peers, now crouched in silence, avoiding eye contact. The authority had worn him down, each small act of obedience chipping away at his dignity. His voice, once firm, had reduced to whispers. The guards noticed his silence, and silence in their new order was treated as defiance. They forced him to speak, demanded louder responses, and when he failed to comply, they made an example of him. It was not just punishment. It was a ritual, a display of power designed to remind everyone else what awaited those who hesitated. The others watched, and in their silence lay the most chilling truth. Some wanted to intervene, but the weight of authority pressed too heavily. Some even convinced themselves that what they witnessed was necessary, that it was part of the structure they had agreed to. Their conscience did not vanish. It drowned, slowly suffocated beneath orders, beneath fear, beneath the desperate desire to belong. That was the true breaking point. Not when people committed atrocities with glee, but when they convinced themselves those atrocities were reasonable. The screams that followed no longer shocked them. The first crease of pain had pierced the air like alarms, making everyone flinch. But repetition dulled their edges. What once caused discomfort now became routine. The guards enforced discipline with mechanical detachment, and the prisoners endured punishment with hollow acceptance. The experiment's sterile walls had absorbed the echoes of suffering, until they no longer sounded out of place. The room itself seemed to conspire in the transformation, becoming less like a laboratory and more like a stage where morality was slowly erased. And yet within this environment, small flashes of humanity flickered, and it was those flickers that revealed the tragedy of the breaking point most clearly. A trembling hand offering brief comfort to a fellow prisoner before being yanked away. A guard who, for a split second, hesitated before delivering a punishment, only to force himself to follow through moments later. A glance exchanged between two participants who once laughed together but now avoided each other's eyes, ashamed of what they had become. Those glimpses of conscience were reminders that humanity had not vanished completely. It had been buried under the crushing weight of authority. The psychological mechanisms at play were invisible, but relentless. Authority did not command violence with screaming demands. It whispered it through uniforms, through clipboards, through the locked door that reminded everyone they were trapped. Conformity did not arrive with a grand announcement. It seeped in through silence, through the collective refusal to resist, through the fear of standing alone. Dehumanization did not erupt overnight. It emerged when names were replaced by numbers, when laughter turned into ridicule, when pain became entertainment. Every step deeper into this cycle was a step further away from the moral compass they once carried, and yet none of them could point to the exact moment they had crossed the line. That was the essence of the breaking point, its invisibility. No one woke up and declared themselves transformed. No one proclaimed, "Now I will commit the unthinkable." Instead, it was a gradual drowning, like slipping beneath water so slowly that you do not realize you are no longer breathing. By the time the participants reached this stage, the unthinkable was already routine and there was no going back. The audience watching this story unfold is left with an unbearable realization. These were not criminals, not psychopaths, not individuals born with cruelty etched into their souls. They were students, workers, neighbors, ordinary people who had been placed in extraordinary circumstances. The breaking point was not their creation alone. It was the product of authority, of roles, of pressure, of a system designed to strip them of choice. But even knowing this, the haunting question lingers. How much of that cruelty was imposed, and how much had always been waiting beneath the surface? The climax of this stage came when hesitation vanished completely. A guard, once timid, carried out punishment with alarming efficiency, no longer needing orders. A prisoner, once proud, begged for mercy, only to be silenced. The dynamic had shifted entirely. What began as a simulation now felt indistinguishable from reality. The roles had consumed the individuals who played them. The experiment no longer needed to guide them. The participants themselves had become enforcers of the very cruelty they once resisted. And when the final acts of this stage unfolded, acts too disturbing to dismiss, too irreversible to undo, the weight of the breaking point settled fully into the room. The participants had crossed thresholds they could never uncross. Even when the experiment ended, even when the uniforms were removed and the doors unlocked, the memory of what they had done and what they had allowed could not be erased. The breaking point was not just a moment in the experiment, it was a fracture in their identities, a permanent scar etched into their understanding of themselves. For the audience, the horror lies not in watching villains act like villains, but in watching ordinary people surrender their humanity piece by piece until there is nothing left to recognize. The breaking point is not a loud explosion of evil. It is a quiet, relentless collapse of conscience. It forces us to confront an unbearable truth. Under the right conditions, the line between good and evil is not a wall, but a thread, and that thread can snap far more easily than we want to believe. The room remained the same at the end. White walls, bright lights, locked doors, but the people inside had been changed forever. And somewhere, deep in the silence that followed, the echoes of the breaking point lingered, whispering to anyone willing to listen, "This could have been you." When the experiment finally ended, there was no applause, no triumphant conclusion, no sense of closure. The doors to the sterile room opened, and the participants were told they could leave. Yet even as they stepped into the ordinary light of day, something heavy clung to them. The fluorescent glare they had lived under for days was gone, but its imprint lingered behind their eyes. The voices of authority were silent, yet their echoes resounded in memory. They carried not just their belongings, but the weight of what they had done: obedience, betrayal, cruelty, silence. These were not things they could leave behind. They followed like shadows, waiting at the threshold of their homes, curling in the corners of their dreams. The experiment was over, but in truth it was only beginning. For some, the first hours afterward brought an overwhelming sense of relief. The uniforms whooshed, the roles dissolved, and with them the suffocating chains of authority seemed to fall away. They told themselves it was just an experiment, nothing more. They tried to believe that the things they had done, orders followed, punishments enforced, cruelty inflicted, belonged to that artificial world, not to them. But denial is a fragile shelter. When they closed their eyes at night, they still saw the faces of those they had mocked, the crease off those they had punished. Relief gave way to unease, and unease deepened into guilt. Others confronted their actions more directly, though the confrontation was no less haunting. They admitted to themselves what they had done, but instead of denial, they sought justification. They clung to the words the experimenters had offered. You were following instructions. You were part of a study. It was necessary. They repeated these explanations like prayers, hoping they would absolve them. Yet just beneath those rehearsed lines lay a gnawing suspicion. Perhaps the truth was simpler and darker. Perhaps they had not merely followed. Perhaps they had chosen. Perhaps the cruelty had not been forced but uncovered. In the weeks that followed, some participants withdrew from those around them. Their families noticed the distance. Conversations grew shorter, smiles rarer. These individuals carried an invisible burden they could not speak of. To confess would be to risk judgment, to reveal a side of themselves they desperately wanted to hide. And so they buried it. Silence became their only refuge, but silence has its own cost. Guilt unspoken does not fade. It festers. It becomes a whisper in quiet rooms, a coldness in moments that should be warm. There were also those who coped through defiance. They laughed off the experiment, treating it as a strange story from the past, an anecdote to share over drinks. You wouldn't believe what they had us do, they would say, framing it as entertainment. But behind the laughter lay unease. Humor became a mask, one they wore to convince others and themselves that none of it mattered. Yet late at night, when laughter fell silent, they found themselves staring at the ceiling, asking questions that refused to go away. Why hadn't they resisted? Why had they allowed themselves to become tools of cruelty? For some, the haunting took the form of dreams. They dreamed of the sterile room, the blinding light, the locked doors. They dreamed of voices commanding them to act, and of themselves obeying without hesitation. In dreams there was no excuse, no framework of experiment to hide behind. The dreams were stark, raw mirrors reflecting their choices. They woke in sweat, heart pounding, haunted not just by what they had done, but by the ease with which they had done it. Sleep, once a refuge, became another prison. What made the aftermath so devastating was not only the memory of cruelty, but the realization of fragility. Each participant had once believed themselves to be moral, decent, incapable of harm. They had walked into the experiment with confidence that their values were solid, but the experiment had shown otherwise. The line between who they thought they were and who they had become was far thinner than they imagined. That realization did not vanish with the experiment. It followed them into every corner of life. Could they still trust themselves? Would they fail again if the conditions aligned? The haunting was not only about the past, but about the terrifying uncertainty of the future. A few tried to seek redemption, They became advocates for ethics, for human rights, for resisting authority. They lectured, they warned, they told their stories in hopes that others might learn. To the outside world, these actions seemed noble, but beneath them, there was often a desperate attempt to balance the scales, to erase or at least diminish the weight of their guilt. Redemption became not just about helping others, but about saving themselves. Yet the question lingered. Could such stains ever truly be erased? The experiment did not just scar individuals, it fractured relationships. Friends who had entered together sometimes left as strangers. Trust, once unshakable, had been shattered. A joke at the wrong time, a command too quickly obeyed, a betrayal too eagerly carried out, these moments could not be unseen. Some avoided each other afterward, unable to reconcile the people they'd once known with the people they had seen inside the experiment. In this way, the haunting spread beyond the participants themselves, rippling into the lives of those around them. The most chilling aspect was how ordinary their lives appeared to outsiders. They returned to work, to family, to daily routines. They smiled, they conversed, they blended into the world. Yet beneath that surface lay the shadows. No one looking at them on a train, in a cafe, at a family gathering would guess the weight they carried. But the experiment had left invisible scars. Every polite smile, every mundane task, every moment of quiet carried with it the silent question, what are we capable of when authority whispers? Some participants spoke of a peculiar sense of dislocation. The world outside the experiment seemed somehow unreal, fragile, as though it could collapse at any moment into the same kind of cruelty. They looked at the structures of society, schools, offices, governments, and saw echoes of the experiment everywhere: uniforms, orders, hierarchies, compliance. What had once seemed ordinary now looked sinister. Authority no longer appeared as a benign force, but as a shadow looming over every interaction. The experiment had not only changed their past, it had changed their vision of the world. And then there were those who broke completely. For them, the weight was too much to bear. Anxiety consumed them, depression followed, relationships crumbled. They could not find a way to reconcile their actions with the image they once had of themselves. Therapy offered some relief, but not always. For some, the experiment was not just a haunting memory. It was the moment that fractured their sense of self beyond repair. Their lives became divided into two eras, before the experiment and after. The haunting extended not only to guilt, but also to shame. Guilt whispers, I did something bad. Shame screams, I am bad. Some participants began to believe that the experiment had revealed their true selves, that the cruelty had not been a mask, but their essence. This belief corroded their confidence, poisoned their relationships, and left them perpetually haunted by self-disgust. They wondered if the people around them could somehow see it, if their families could sense the darkness within. The experiment became a ghost story they carried silently, one they rarely spoke aloud. And yet, despite the silence, its power never weakened. It shaped their choices, their fears, their hopes. It influenced how they raised their children, how they treated strangers, how they responded to authority. Some became fiercely independent, refusing to ever again surrender their will. Others became hyper-aware of group dynamics, wary of the subtle pressures that could lead to conformity. The haunting was not uniform, but it was universal. No one walked away unchanged. What lingered most deeply was the question of forgiveness. Could they forgive themselves? Should they? Some believed forgiveness was impossible, that to forgive was to forget, and forgetting would dishonor the suffering they had caused. Others sought forgiveness as a way to heal, though the process was slow and uncertain. In truth, forgiveness remained elusive, always just out of reach. The shadows of the experiment did not allow for easy closure. The experiment may have ended in a physical sense, but its true conclusion was never written. It lived on in the minds of the participants, in the stories they dared not tell, in the nights they could not sleep, in the uneasy silence that settled whenever the past threatened to surface. Long after the doors had closed, the sterile room continued to exist, not as a place of walls and light, but as a memory etched into the human soul. And so the haunting persists, not just for those who lived it, but for all who hear their story. Because the most unsettling realization is not merely that ordinary people committed cruelty, but that we might too. The shadows in their lives are mirrors for our own. The haunting is not theirs alone. It belongs to all of us, a reminder that the line between good and evil is as fragile as silence, as ordinary as obedience, and as permanent as memory. When the final curtain of the experiment fell, what remained was not only a record of human behavior under pressure, but also a mirror that reflected something far larger, the human condition itself. The sterile walls, the chairs, the switches, the scripted instructions, all of them dissolved into symbols, reminders that the abyss revealed within that room was not confined to the experiment. It was everywhere, always waiting, hidden just beneath the surface of civilization. The story that began as a simple test of obedience ended as a revelation about the terrifying fragility of morality. And the lesson, though uncomfortable, was undeniable. The monsters we fear are not distant mythical beings, but reflections of ourselves. Every war crime, every massacre, every act of cruelty in the streets or in the silence of a home, each is fueled by the same invisible forces that were unleashed in that chamber. The abyss is not a distant pit, it is inside us. The most haunting realization is that the experiment did not create cruelty out of thin air. It revealed how easily cruelty can be coaxed out of ordinary people. Theirs were not hardened criminals, nor sadists seeking pleasure in suffering. They were volunteers, students, workers, neighbors, people who outside the walls might have held doors open for strangers or smiled at children on the street. And yet when confronted with authority, with pressure, with the assurance that responsibility lay elsewhere, they crossed lines they once swore were unthinkable. That is the lesson that cannot be softened or dismissed. If ordinary individuals could descend into darkness so quickly, what does that say about the rest of us? If their conscience bent under pressure, what makes us so certain ours would hold? The abyss whispers an answer we do not want to hear, perhaps nothing. Perhaps the line between kindness and cruelty is thinner than we imagine, a thread stretched tight across the weight of authority and circumstance. History echoes with this truth. The same mechanics revealed in that laboratory have played out on battlefields, in prison camps, in city streets, filled with mobs chanting in unison. Authority commands, fear silences, the crowd amplifies, and suddenly the unthinkable becomes routine. What begins with words escalates into orders. What begins with hesitation ends in obedience. In that room, participants pressed switches and delivered what they believed to be pain because they were told to. Outside in the world, soldiers have pulled triggers, jailers have closed doors, and crowds have turned against neighbors, all for the same reason. The abyss does not distinguish between uniforms and lab coats. It does not need a sterile setting or fluorescent lights. It thrives anywhere humans are gathered, anywhere fear or obedience outweighs compassion. That is the most chilling lesson. The triggers are universal, the outcome disturbingly predictable. And yet, the lesson does not come with comfort. For while the abyss shows us how fragile our morality is, it also denies us the shield of denial. It is tempting to believe that only certain types of people are capable of cruelty, monsters, villains, the broken and the mad. But the experiment dismantles that illusion. The participants were ordinary, just like us. They laughed, they hesitated, they doubted. But under pressure, they obeyed. What if the only difference between them and us is that they were tested and we were not? Would we resist or would we also obey? The question is unanswerable, but it hangs heavy. A shadow that clings to the mind. Every viewer, every reader is forced to confront it. The abyss is not a story about others. It is a story about ourselves. The lesson stretches further, into the structures of power that govern society. Authority, the experiment revealed, can override the individual conscience. But authority does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers, cloaked in uniforms, laws, traditions, or the simple weight of conformity. We see it in institutions that demand obedience, in systems that thrive on silence, in communities where dissent is punished not by law, but by shame and exclusion. Each small surrender, each quiet compliance widens the crack until morality collapses. In that sterile room, authority came from an experimenter in a white coat. In the real world, it comes from leaders, from laws, from the faceless weight of bureaucracy. And the abyss warns us. If we are not vigilant, authority can become the mask through which cruelty operates. What makes the abyss unforgettable is not only its relevance to grand horrors like genocide or war, but also its reflection in everyday life. Cruelty does not always wear boots and march with banners. Sometimes it appears in smaller, quieter forms. An insult delivered because the group demanded it. A silence kept when a voice was needed. A punishment inflicted because that's the rule. The same forces, obedience, fear, conformity, shape the choices we make daily. Every time we laugh at a cruel joke to fit in, every time we watch injustice and do nothing, every time we obey even when it feels wrong, we are brushing against the edges of the abyss. It does not require dramatic acts to reveal itself. It lives in the subtle compromises that erode conscience, one decision at a time. And so, the experiment becomes not only a lesson but a warning. The abyss is not a relic of the past. It is alive, active, always waiting. In times of crisis, when fear spreads, when leaders demand loyalty, when groups turn against outsiders, the same forces can awaken again. What happened in that room is not an isolated phenomenon, but our rehearsal of history's darkest chapters. The Holocaust, the massacres of war, the violence of mobs, all of them follow the same script. Authority commands, people obey, conscience weakens, cruelty thrives. The lesson of the abyss is that we must recognize these patterns before they take hold, before ordinary people are once again transformed into instruments of destruction. Yet even as the experiment exposes the darkness, it also plants a fragile seed of hope. For not every participant obeyed without question. Some hesitated, some resisted, some refused. Their voices were fewer, weaker, but they existed. And in that resistance lies a counter-lesson. The abyss is powerful but not inevitable. The forces that drag us down, obedience, conformity, fear, can be resisted by courage, by awareness, by the willingness to stand alone when others obey. The experiment does not only reveal a capacity for cruelty, it also reveals the rare but vital capacity for defiance. And that is where the true lesson lies. If we understand the abyss, we may learn how to resist it. But resistance requires honesty, and honesty is painful. It means admitting that the abyss is not about them, the others, the villains. It is about us. It means accepting that under certain conditions, we too might obey, we too might cross lines. Without this honesty, Thelison is wasted. Without it, we will continue to believe the comforting lie that cruelty belongs only to monsters, never to neighbors, never to ourselves. The abyss teaches that the capacity for darkness is universal, but in that universality lies responsibility. If we all share the potential for cruelty, then we all share the duty to resist it. Thirstrel room may be empty now, its lights off, its switches silent, its doors closed, but its legacy endures. Every story of cruelty, every headline of violence, every injustice in the world today can be traced back to the same patterns revealed in that chamber. The abyss lingers not as a historical footnote, but as a constant reminder, whispering that civilization is fragile, that morality is fragile, that the distance between kindness and cruelty is measured not in miles but in moments. The lesson of the abyss is not comfortable, but it is necessary. It forces us to look inward, to confront the shadows we carry, and to ask ourselves the most unsettling question of all. When the moment comes, when authority commands and the crowd obeys, will we resist or will we step forward into the abyss? The doors of the laboratory may have closed, the clipboard set aside and the cameras switched off, but the true experiment never ended. What happened within those sterile walls did not stay contained. It spilled out into the lives of those who took part, and more disturbingly, into the consciousness of the world that later learned their story. To call it an experiment feels too small. It was not a puzzle solved nor a theory tested. It was a revelation, a wound cut open across the fabric of human nature, exposing something raw, something uncomfortable, something we spend most of our lives trying not to see. The participants walked away, their turn to dorm rooms, offices, homes and classrooms. They greeted friends, laughed with families, and went on with their lives. On the surface, they blended back into normality. But within, each carried a secret they could never fully put down. Some carried it as shame, others as denial, and a few as cold justification. Yet no one escaped unmarked, because once you have heard your own voice demand cruelty, once you have felt obedience flow more easily than compassion, you cannot pretend you are the same as before. This is where the true shadow of the experiment lies, not in the room, not in the commands, not even in the screams, but in the realization it planted inside every participant, and inside us who hear the story. The terrifying truth that cruelty does not come from monsters. It comes from us. We are taught to imagine evil as something alien, something separate, something that lives in dictators, criminals, or twisted villains lurking on the fringes of society. That belief comforts us. It lets us draw a line between them and us, between the corrupt and the innocent, between the dark and the light. But the experiment shattered that illusion. It showed that cruelty can wear a polite face, can sit quietly at a desk, can smile as it obeys. It showed that ordinary men and women, people who might have been your neighbors, classmates, or colleagues, could step into roles of tormentors with unnerving ease. And this is why the story remains unforgettable. Because the question it leaves behind is not, what did they do? But what would I have done? That is the abyss. That is the mirror we are forced to look into. Authority is a fragile, dangerous spark. Alone, it is nothing more than a command, a word, a symbol. But when combined with obedience, it ignites. When combined with fear, it spreads. When combined with silence, it consumes. In that ignition, something inside us begins to erode. Conscience, empathy, hesitation, things we think of as unshakable pillars of morality, suddenly seem weaker than we imagined. Step by step, inch by inch, they crumble under pressure, until acts that once seemed unthinkable become routine. This is not history. This is not confined to the dusty pages of psychology textbooks. We see the same forces in the world around us every day. We see it in mobs that turn violent because no one dares to stand apart. We see it in soldiers who commit atrocities because they are told it is duty. We see it in workplaces where silence allows cruelty to thrive, in schools where bullies gain power because others look away, in societies where laws are bent because obedience is easier than resistance. The abyss is not an ancient relic. It is alive. It walks with us. And this is the most haunting revelation. The participants were not monsters when they entered that room. They were not born cruel. They were not extraordinary in their flaws. They were ordinary in every possible sense, ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, which means the line between them and us does not exist, which means the experiment is not about them. It is about humanity itself. It is about me. It is about you. The scar of the experiment is not the memory of cruelty. It is the recognition of possibility. The recognition that the same switch that flipped inside those participants exists inside us all. The recognition that under the right pressures, the right silence, the right commands, we too could step forward, put on the mask of obedience and obey. And so the shadow remains. Not just in psychology, not just in history, but in every choice we face when authority presses against conscience, when silence seems easier than resistance, when cruelty can be disguised as order. What makes this conclusion terrifying is not the acts committed in the room, but the ordinariness of the people who committed them. Evil was not revealed as some alien force. It was revealed as human. Too human. So what lessons are left for us, standing outside the experiment, staring into its reflection? First, we must never assume immunity. The belief that I would never is the first step toward blindness. It is precisely those who believe they are immune who are most vulnerable because they never prepare themselves to resist. The participants too may have believed beforehand, I would never, yet under the fluorescent lights many of them did. Second, resistance is not born in the moment of crisis. It must be cultivated. Courage is not a sudden flame. It is a discipline, a habit formed by choosing integrity in small everyday acts. If we do not learn to speak up in the ordinary moments of life, how can we expect ourselves to resist in the extraordinary ones? Third, silence is not neutral. Every act of obedience strengthens authority. Every moment of compliance gives cruelty room to grow. Silence, too, is a form of participation. The experiment showed us this with brutal clarity. Those who did not resist still became part of the machine. Finally, the greatest defense against the abyss is not fear, but awareness. By remembering, by teaching, by refusing to forget what was revealed, we keep the mirror polished. We keep ourselves uncomfortable. And in discomfort, there is vigilance. The experiment may have ended decades ago, but the questions it raises have no expiration. They live on, whispering at the edges of every society, every hierarchy, every command. And they whisper to us personally, what would you have done? What will you do when the test comes to you? Not in a lab, but in life. Because the truth is unavoidable. The abyss is not in the past. It is within us, waiting. And so we end not with closure, but with confrontation. The participants walked out of the lab with invisible scars. We walk away from their story with a choice. When the command comes, when silence tempts, when obedience demands cruelty, will we obey, or will we resist? Look into the mirror. Do not look away. The reflection staring back is humanity itself, and in its eyes the abyss waits for your answer.